legit. Anything you want.
The president has declared a national emergency and is using that as justification to build his wall. Can he do that? In ancient Rome, the dictator was a temporary position given to the head of state in times of emergency. So giving emergency power to the president is not a new idea. But there's nothing like that in the Constitution. The Constitution makes no provision for a national emergency and does not recognize anything like emergency powers. But some argue that the president has been delegated those powers by Congress. So today we're going to talk about President Trump's emergency declaration. Number one, I want to talk about what emergency powers the president does actually have. Number two, I want to talk about whether there is in fact an emergency that allows the president to invoke those powers. Number three, I want to talk about what powers Congress has and which it has bestowed on the president. And number four, I want to talk about the possible outcomes that may come as a result of this national emergency declaration and what that means for future presidents. In other words, are we going to see a lot of new declarations of national emergencies over things like the environment, gun control, or healthcare? So let's talk about the first question. What emergency powers does the president have, and can the president act outside of those enumerated powers? Well, with few exceptions, the president can only act with congressional authorization. The president has broad executive and enforcement authority to use his or her discretion to determine how to enforce the law or how to otherwise manage the resources of the executive branch. But the president has virtually no authority to pass laws or appropriate funds without Congress. And in fact, in the famous case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, the Supreme Court ruled that President Harry Truman's attempt to nationalize U.S. steel mills during a strike in the Korean War was in fact unconstitutional. So as one congressperson has said, if Harry Truman couldn't nationalize the steel industry during wartime, this president doesn't have the power to declare an emergency and build a multi-billion-dollar wall on the border. Now, one of the first fundamental issues that is implicated by this emergency declaration is the appropriations issue. According to Article 1 of the Constitution, only Congress can appropriate federal funds. Article 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution states that all legislative powers herein are granted and shall be vested in the Congress. Article 1, Section 8 states that Congress has the exclusive spending power to, quote, provide for the general welfare of the United States. Lawsuits have already been filed stating that President Trump has violated the United States Constitution's separation of powers doctrine by taking executive action to fund a border wall without Congress actually appropriating the correct funding. Those lawsuits have argued that the 2019 Appropriations Act is an explicit denial of the president's requested funds for the border wall. Those lawsuits also argue that the president has violated the separation of powers doctrine by unilaterally diverting funds that Congress has already appropriated for other things that are not related to the border wall. And Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution states that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. The lawsuits argue that Congress heard the president's request and explicitly rejected the request to appropriate funds to build any kind of border wall. So the recent Attorneys General lawsuit argues that President Trump violated the Appropriations Clause of the Constitution by funding construction for a border wall with funds that were not appropriated for that purpose. But here, the Trump administration will counter that Congress has in fact passed a law that gives him authority to do this. A number of laws do in fact authorize the president to take certain actions by declaring a national emergency. The primary law that the president seems to be operating under is the National Emergencies Act of 1976, as amended in 1985, which governs the president's declaration of a national emergency. Now, under the NEA, the president must specifically state the law under which he proposes to act, and he still has to comply with the provisions of that law. This is incredibly important because the redesignated funds must still comply with the original law under which the funds were appropriated. The first preliminary issue is, can the president even invoke the NEA in these circumstances? The question is there an emergency? And it also depends on what the definition of an emergency is. The term emergency is not defined in the National Emergencies Act, and this fact cuts in a couple of different directions. On the one hand, some argue that this gives the president carte blanche to declare anything an emergency because the NEA doesn't specify what constitutes an emergency. But I think that misses the point. One of the jobs of the courts from time immemorial is to provide definitions where a particular statute is silent or ambiguous. In the case of federal laws, courts often look to the intent of Congress to impute a definition to an otherwise undefined term. And let's be clear, there is no emergency as most people understand that word. Merriam-Webster's defines emergency as a, quote, unforeseen combination of circumstances or the resulting state that calls for immediate action. President Trump has said himself that this was not strictly necessary. He could have gone through regular channels, but he wanted to do it faster.
I want to do it faster. I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
And in the present day, illegal immigration is at near historic lows. The president may not be satisfied with those numbers, but as most people understand the lay definition of emergency, it doesn't seem like there's any argument that it fits. It seems very likely that this is not the kind of situation that Congress had in mind when passing the 1976 National Emergencies Act. In fact, that particular law was an attempt to curtail presidential power that had been exercised by the Nixon administration. So it is possible that the court will defer to whatever the president declares as a national emergency. I don't think the courts that look at this will do so, in part because of the political ramifications that might allow future presidents to declare whatever they want as an emergency. But that being said, it isn't uncommon for courts to have to weigh in on the definitions of terms in various laws. And if the court uses a lay definition of emergency, then it's likely that this particular situation would not qualify, and that may end the analysis of this particular legal question right there. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that this does qualify as a national emergency, or the court takes a deferential view that says basically anything can be a national emergency. Well, now that means that we have to look at the second part. What laws are invoked in order to reappropriate the funds? Because as I mentioned before, the president still has to comply with the underlying laws that pass the funds in the first place. One of the laws that the president is relying on to receive the lion's share of the billions of dollars he's asking for border wall construction deals with military construction. Under this military construction law, 33 U.S.C. 2293, the president may terminate or defer military construction that he has deemed non-essential to the national defense and may apply those resources for a project to construct another project which he considers essential. But the reappropriated funds under this particular law must still constitute military construction. And given the fact that we are not at war with Mexico, it makes it a hard sell to claim that a border wall is a military construction project. In addition, this particular construction project does not require the armed forces to build. And in fact, there is an argument to be made that the military cannot be used to build this particular project under the Posse Comitatus rule. Posse Comitatus is a doctrine that is enshrined in statutory law in the United States that says you cannot use the military for domestic projects, especially not enforcement. You might recall that when President Trump sent troops to the border to fight against an alleged caravan of potential immigrants and refugees, they weren't actually sent to the border to fight, but really to only provide backup services to the Department of Homeland Security. That was largely because of the doctrine of Posse Comitatus, which says that you cannot use armed forces domestically. So even if the president is able to get over the hurdle of declaring a national emergency, he's still going to have a number of hurdles with respect to the underlying law from which he is taking the appropriated funds. Now, on the other hand, the government will probably argue that the courts should give broad deference to the president's determination that there is a national emergency, and also broad deference as to what constitutes military construction. As the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, we don't often want to be able to second guess the commander-in-chief's ability to declare what is essential to the national defense and what isn't. So if this case gets to the Supreme Court and isn't bounced on some technicality, it's completely unclear which way the Supreme Court might go on this. There are long strings of cases that are deferential to the president and the president's authority to act where the Constitution allows it. So this is certainly not a slam dunk for either side. And this is also one of those areas where the traditional cleavages of liberal versus conservative justices on the Supreme Court don't always make sense. Sometimes the conservative justices vote to curtail executive power, and sometimes the more liberal members of the Supreme Court take the view that the executive powers should be very expansive. So when it comes to who might view this as an overreach and who might view this as a perfectly reasonable thing for a president to do, all bets are off. I should note, however, that litigation over this emergency declaration is going to have issues with standing and ripeness. This is always a perennial issue when you have these kinds of acts and political questions. In order to file a lawsuit, you have to have what's called standing, which means that you have to be personally aggrieved in order to file suit. And in terms of standing, individual members of Congress do not have standing, but sometimes Congress as a body does. Sometimes affected states have standing, sometimes they don't. There's also the issue of ripeness. Since only the declaration has been made and no action has actually been taken, it's not clear that this case is actually ripe for adjudication. But the recent litigation in California, which deals with dozens of states attorneys general, and several farmers who are likely to be affected by this emergency declaration, looks to solve some of those standing and ripeness issues. But no matter what, this will have huge implications for future presidential actions. Those on both sides of the aisle are right to worry about the president in this particular setting. When the Senate passed the National Emergencies Act, it stated in the notes of passage that the NEA was designed to ensure that the president's extraordinary emergency powers would be utilized only when emergencies actually exist. Under the National Emergencies Act, Congress has 18 days to adopt a joint resolution to terminate the declaration. But that joint resolution is subject to a presidential veto. And recent Supreme Court authority has stated that a presidential veto can only be overturned by a 2/3 vote in both houses. And this is incredibly unlikely. So that means that if the court upholds the Trump administration's declaration of emergency here, the likely outcome is that the next president, and potentially the president after that, is likely to be able to declare almost anything a national emergency in that case as well. And at least in my opinion, that seems like exactly what the framers of the Constitution tried to avoid when they gave the exclusive right to pass laws and the exclusive right to make appropriations only to Congress. President Trump made a major mistake by saying that he didn't need to issue the declaration of emergency and could have used the regular legislative process. He really could have benefited from Soledad O'Brien's Skillshare class, Powerful Storytelling Today. If he had taken the class on crafting a great story and message, his legal defense would be in much better shape. He also could have benefited from Simon Sinek's class on how to share ideas that inspire action. Because so far, the only action that President Trump has inspired is a bunch of lawsuits. Skillshare is an online learning community that has over 20,000 classes on everything, like leadership, technology, and business. The first 500 Legal Eagles will get 2 free months of Skillshare when you click on the link below. The free premium membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things. Improve yourself now and avoid your own personal emergencies. So click on the link, get 2 free months, and start learning to think like a lawyer today. So, do you agree? Leave your objections in the comments. Check out my other Real Law reviews here for more legal analysis. And until next time, I'll see you in court.